Capital Record, where we defend free enterprise and capital markets because we believe in the dignity of the human person. Hello and welcome to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review. We are going through as many issues as we can week by week that seem to have some relevance right now in the news cycle, like kind of real life events happening around matters of the economy, public policy, things that are impacting markets, whatever the case may be, and trying to approach them with first principles, talk about them from the vantage point of a distinctly pro-free enterprise philosophy, but one that is, in my case, rooted to the distinctives of a worldview. And it's what we've done since we started Capital Record over 4 years ago. And right now I'm enjoying kind of bite-sized episodes, maybe 15 to 30 minutes an episode, talking about real life issues. And one of the things that's kind of gotten into the news cycle over the last week or so, this term Doge is all over the place. And that's a political story with the new administration, this so-called Department of Government Efficiency. And there's plenty that people can say about Elon Musk and what Doge is doing and not doing and what they like and don't like and all of that. And I actually think it's a big, important story, but I'm not sure it's a particularly economic one unless we get into a specific part of it. And that's what I want to do right now is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a sort of casualty right now in the efforts of the new Trump administration to be right-sizing government or making more efficient components of government. And what they've done has gotten a lot of attention around this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Well, I created this podcast to defend capital markets and to make the case that robust financial markets are a tool in the cause of human flourishing. So if we're going to have a public policy that seeks to basically diminish Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it could sound as if there is something happening that is weakening protections for consumers from our financial markets. And wouldn't that be a horrible thing? In other words, a discussion of the good, bad, and ugly of the CFPB is important for those of us that are taking this subject seriously about public policy, economics, and of course, their role in driving a better lived experience for humanity. And I don't think you're going to hear the term better lived experience for humanity in the same sentence as CFPB very often. And I want to have that conversation with you today. A little bit of historical background. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was first proposed by then law professor Elizabeth Warren, fresh off of one of the annual Indian reservation meets, I assume, but employed by Harvard University in 2007. And it kind of sat for a little while, although it did help to make her more famous as we go through the financial crisis. And then the president of the United States, of course, at this point has become Barack Obama. Congress took advantage of that moment to pass signature legislation within the first 2 years of the Obama administration that was called Dodd-Frank. And it substantially rewrote a lot of the expectations of financial regulation in our country in the aftermath of the financial crisis. It was co-authored by then Senator Chris Dodd and then Representative Barney Frank, hence the term Dodd-Frank. It was an abysmal piece of legislation for a lot of reasons that I ought to maybe get into more a different time. Dodd-Frank is not in the news right now. CFPB is. So I'll focus on that. But in addition to the other elements that made Dodd-Frank a abysmal piece of legislation, one of the pieces of it was that it created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. This brought Elizabeth Warren back into our orbit because Barack Obama appointed her to be the first commissioner of the agency. though because she was not going to be able to get Senate approval, they kind of left her in this bizarrely unaccountable, unappointed, sort of authoritarian role. You know, the stuff they say about Elon Musk now. Well, that's what Warren was doing for a period of time. And then eventually President Obama nominated the first director in an official capacity. I want to say his name was Richard Corduroy. I think that's correct. And even he couldn't get Senate approval, so he did him by interim appointment. So, it's so funny. A lot of these things that people talk about as being so, outside of protocol, they hardly lack precedence. But all that to say, basically, it is historically accurate to say the CFPB was a brainchild of Elizabeth Warren, enacted by President Obama, created legislatively under Dodd-Frank, but highly controversial because it was never designed, it was never written to be funded by congressional appropriation. It was funded by the Fed and therefore allowed for a commissioner who would get congressional approval, but then have no oversight after that. So a funding mechanism that, much to my surprise, the Supreme Court on appeal ended up ruling was allowed, but a governance structure that the Supreme Court indeed ruled was highly problematic. And so that's why Doge and the Trump administration, and of course many conservatives, including myself, for years have been trying to unwind and put down. And they've more or less right now really defanged this group, because what they've done is fired a bunch of people, and then they've named OMB director Russ Voigt to be the kind of interim director. And I think he's going to kind of just sit on it for a bit. But yeah, I mean, designing it to have a director with unilateral powers could only be removed by the president in a case of some significant neglect or duty. It really basically allowed this agency to operate outside the purview of Congress, and yet with no real understanding as to what in the world it exists to do. Now, people say, of course, in the title, it says it's there to protect consumers from the financial sector, that there is a broad financial industry, and whether it's banks or non-bank entities or credit unions, asset managers, there's all sorts of financial actors in our economy, and presumably CFPB has some form of regulatory oversight. But of course they don't. The Securities and Exchange Commission oversees much of financial markets. There's a Federal Reserve that has a regulatory apparatus. There is the CFTC overseeing futures and commodities. The OCC overseeing options clearing. Housing Urban Development overseeing much of real estate, mortgage. FHFA overseeing much of our mortgage lending, and the agencies around the government-sponsored enterprises, and there's the FDIC that oversees the banking system, the now NCUA that oversees credit unions, of course the Federal Trade Commission that oversees many of these entities as well. Not only did I just name 10 entities that have oversight of something specialized, many of them have redundancies and duplications in their oversight with one another. And then you created kind of a triple level of duplication with the CFPB. Now, is my criticism here the structure that it lacks oversight by Congress, the funding it's not appropriated, the ambiguity as to what the agency's portfolio really includes, the inefficiency of all the redundancies across other regulatory bodies? Is that my criticism? Well, yes, but wait, there's more. Now, it just so happens that everything I said should infuriate people. And I'm going to get to the reasons why in a moment. If all I'm doing is making another typical, limited government appeal for greater efficiency, I think that's an important case to make, but I'm actually wanting to do even more than that. There are anecdotal things that we could point to, by the way, that should not be the crux of the argument, but do anecdotally matter. Spending $55 million in 2013 to renovate their building, that's a lot of credit card fees that they could have passed back on to the consumers who had been pillaged by their greedy credit card company, or points they could have added, in airline miles that they took away from people out of the credit card point regulation. Why these government bureaucrats always seem to need Taj Mahals to do business in. And by the way, this is like 2 years into their existence as an agency. Normally we wait till about 10 years till we start spending $100 million on big upgrades to our taxpayer funded amenities. But, that type of stuff is perverse to me, but again, it's anecdotally perverse. The issue I want to draw attention to is that there were absolutely no new protections that have ever been offered by an agency that was there to employ thousands of people. There was replication and duplication, and then this inefficient centralization of tasks that were already specialized to other entities. What was needed was optimization, not doubling down on inefficiency. They added to problems. They didn't take away problems. They needed to decentralize an inefficient regulatory apparatus. And by doing this in the most unaccountable, poor governance, poorly funded way imaginable, they made the problem much worse. But it wasn't like we had a financial system that said fraud is legal. And the CFPB came in and said, no, our agency says fraud is now illegal. They already had restrictions against the various things that they were there to enforce. And they already had entities that had real congressionally apportioned oversight that had teeth into what they were doing at the FDIC or the Treasury Department or the Securities Exchange Commission, et cetera. So the CFPB became bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. And this is where my insistence on fighting for the cause of human flourishing comes from. Do human beings flourish in financial systems riddled with fraud, corruption, and greed and whatnot? Of course not. But do humans benefit from entities that have no ability to improve any of that, but only add paperwork, that centralize power with unaccountable bureaucrats? They make things worse, all the while giving the veneer of a safer system. In other words, it creates a moral hazard. People believe that there are overseers and qualified experts looking out for their best interest, when there are not. There is merely bureaucracy that is ineffectual. It adds to the problem. It creates a fragility when you believe that there are protections in place that are not. Who do they go after? Well, first, they create a public government website to allow people to register complaints that is then available for the world to see, allowing all sorts of bots and false witness and false testimony with no due process, no accountability. So you created a government-sponsored forum for people to lie about one another. Now, were some of the accusations true? Or some of the experiences true? Of course, but is it the government's responsibility to create this unaccountable consumer watchdog that is abused and misused and does damage to the credibility of our nation's financial actors that have no venue, no forum by which they can get their reputations back? It was a disgusting facilitation of people violating the Ninth Commandment and totally unprecedented. With the SEC, there are charges that get filed, but people get due process. Allowing a government-sponsored forum on public website to make accusations against financial actors was just a horrific misuse of resources. They go after entities like payday lenders, like certain credit card companies, again, that they don't even have direct oversight over, but then they allow additional adversarial relationship with groups that are vital to the nation's financial system. Attacking small ball things. I already did an episode last week about this horrific idea of capping the amount of interest that credit card companies can charge. They took this to another level by going after the point system, reward system with debit cards and credit cards and things like this. That again, there may very well be situations where people believe the credit card companies should be giving more points or they should be charging less overdraft fees. Everyone's allowed to have opinions on that. Card companies are allowed to compete with each other for either better benefits or lower overdraft fees or what have you. But adding this additional bureaucracy to the mix essentially created the worst of all worlds, because what it did is distract resources from something that could actually be efficient, and then created a subsidy to big companies while they diminished the ability of smaller companies to go compete with things like points and rewards and that type of stuff. So really just a absolutely awful set of priorities that they went about doing, but that's what happens with unaccountable agencies that don't have a clear mandate. And then this brings me to my final point, that was something that came out on January 10th, 2025. Now, you may notice that's barely a month ago, and it was exactly 10 days before the inauguration. So the new CFPB under President Trump is right now in a period of being totally defanged. What was one of the final things the robust, bureaucratic, heavily armed Biden administration CFPB does? And this is straight from their own website. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put out a notice that they were looking for gamers. They want to hear from you, actually advertising and soliciting for video game users to report stories where they believed their video game tokens and points and currencies and whatnot were not being done fairly. They're asking for people who play video games to report on when their online tokens and points from their game usage was leaving them with inadequate loot, and asking them, doing a full, looking for whistleblowers to share their experience about video game currencies. I lack the words to tell you how insultingly stupid this is. That in the aftermath of a financial crisis that cost our world's financial system trillions of dollars, that legislation was passed to supposedly solve for systemic risk, to deal with people that were victims of horrific mortgage fraud, that in its final hour has defaulted to asking video game users if they're getting their Super Mario tokens or not. Dear Lord, what is wrong with these people? And we think this is advancing protection of consumers. This is how you undermine the human flourishing made possible by free enterprise. It is not from free enterprise. It is not from financial markets that facilitate goods and services that allow for greater exchange. It is this regulatory apparatus that goes to unaccountable bureaucrats when they're not doing $55 million building renovations, wanting to find people to go tattle on others dealing with video game tokens. This has to stop. This is deep state, actually properly defined. It's perverse, and it is nothing to do with protecting our nation's financial system. What we need is deregulation, consolidation, and a significant decentralization, eliminating alphabet soup. And I would start with 4 letters that could be eliminated from that soup immediately. Those 4 letters are CFPB. Thank you for listening to David Bahnsen's Capital Record, brought to you by National Review. Reach out with questions, comments, feedback anytime. Send it to me directly, questions@thebahnsengroup.com. And look forward to being with you very, very soon. Enjoy your weekend.